Hey, good evening and welcome everyone. Welcome to our second installment of BIPOC Dialogue presented by ASLA New York. My name is Tae-wook Cha. I'm the co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at ASLA New York. And this evening, we welcome our featured speakers, which are Alomar, FASLA, and Lucila Silva-Santisteban. Richard Alomar is the chair and graduate program director at the Department of Landscape Architecture at Rutgers University. He's also the founder of the Urban Field Studio, a landscape architecture practice that explores the connections between global climate research and practical local applications. In 2019, Richard became involved with a partnership in Las Carolinas, Puerto Rico, where he came from, in which the community's residents are collaborating with the University of Puerto Rico, RWJBarnabas Health, and Rutgers to build resilience following the devastation brought by hurricanes Maria and Irma in 2017. Richard's role has centered around helping the residents develop a vegetable garden on the site of the volunteer-run community kitchen. In 2022, Richard was elevated to the prestigious ASLA Council of Fellows in recognition of his service to the community. Our other featured speaker, Lucila Silva-Santisteban, is a project designer at Enea Landscape Architecture. She is a Latina landscape architect from Bogota, Colombia, and currently part of the design team at Enea Landscape in Brooklyn, New York. Her commitment and passion to make the landscape field a more equitable and inclusive profession has pushed her to seek licensure to have the opportunity to participate in decision-making processes at both project and policy levels, ensuring that diversity and inclusion are prioritized. So give a round of silent welcome to Richard and Lucila and Richard and Lucila, please take it away.
Yeah. Thank you, Tae-wook. Thank you for the intros. I don't know, Richard, if you want to add anything more about things that we don't know that Tae-wook did not mention. But in my case, yeah, I want to say that as well. From coming from Colombia, I'm also Peruvian, so I do have that. I carry that heritage of Latin culture very in my life, in my lifestyle, and yeah, in practice as well. But yeah.
So I just wanted to thank you all for having me here, for the invitation. It's great to be able to, first of all, be here and then just talk about whatever comes up. And by the way, I just got back from Bogota. And it's really different because there's a huge difference between, there's not a huge difference, but you can tell the difference between Colombia and Puerto Rico. Let's just put it that.
Exactly.
I guess unless you go to the coast, if you go to Cartagena or somewhere like that, maybe there's more similarities.
Exactly. No, I know. And I think I wanted to start this conversation by talking about sort of the Latin identity and how it changes, as you just have mentioned. And that is something very interesting that for me, in my case, I've experienced it only here in the US, and how we see ourselves, like, as you say, you are from Puerto Rico, or like from, and I say I'm from Colombia, but then once you land on US soil, all of a sudden you become in this category. And I remember what you shared with me, this interview of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, where he was talking about how the landscape is something that talks about your identity and feeds you, and is part of of how you function in the world.
Yeah, because I think so. Like, I understand the reasoning behind having these categories, right? To put people in these sort of identities or boxes, because it makes it from a professional and maybe a business level, it makes it easier to sort of formulate things, right? But in reality, I think it's almost it does a kind of disservice to us as individuals, right? To sort of see somebody as a Latino or Latina or Puerto Rican or Peruvian or something like that, especially when these categories are made by people that aren't Puerto Rican, Colombian, Peruvian, right? So it's somebody else's category, and then trying to wiggle your way into somebody else's definition of something. And sometimes I don't even know what the definition is, right? So it gets a little bit confusing. But there is a certain beauty to just, identifying as yourself, right? And for us, each other to have to take the time to get to know each other, to really understand who you are, as opposed to using this simple category, right? The simple category and sort of, oh, I know who she is. She's Latina. I know who he is. He's from the Caribbean. I understand. I can make general stereotypes and put you in a category and walk off, as opposed to getting to know you and understanding the joys and the pleasure of being who you are as a person, as a person.
No, for sure. And I think that throughout, like, me, for example, like when I came here to the US and they put you in this category, but they also cannot figure out which category you are in because you look a certain way or you don't follow that stereotype. It's also a little bit challenging sometimes, and not in, maybe it's privilege, maybe it's not privilege, maybe it's bad or good, but it definitely creates your own experience. Um, I think also that, but at the same time, I think that as Latin heritage people that we all also share many things as a culture, like as a global culture, as a regional culture that differentiates us from European culture, from Asian culture, and we do at some points we do have these touching, these connecting points. If it's music, if it's maybe sometimes not food specifically, because even in the same country we vary of food and languages and everything, but sometimes when you're away from home, we have these points of connection that they're really beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of true. I mean, we do have these, like you said, we do have these touch points.
Yeah.
We have language as a connector, even though we have our different, the beauty of it, we have this common language, but we have regional variations of the language, and then we have accents, and we have all these sort of things that, you know, sometimes it's hard to understand a certain country's Spanish the same way it may be for people up north to understand a southern drawl, right?
Yeah.
I remember in Louisiana, it took me a long time to figure out what people were saying, and I knew English, right? So
Yeah.
that
Or
was
with
a challenge.
British English that
Or
it takes you
British English,
a little
yeah,
while to
or anything
totally
like that.
understand. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So we have
No,
the
for
commonality of language. We also have the commonality of the Spaniards, right? The whole institution and
correct.
the whole big thing about the conquistadors and later on the kings and the queens, right? So that's a
Yeah.
whole other thing. And
Animal.
religion, Catholicism,
Yeah.
it's a heavy
Which is true. And
legacy.
then one of the inheritance of this colonization was the economic differences that we have as a reality in our countries. That maybe we need to study this more, but it's probably something that was inherited by the Spanish colonization, that we still have this struggle of these very, very different economic states and issues. And so that is why we are called developing countries. And I think to that, I think you have experienced this as well when you studied in Puerto Rico, that all of the curriculum and all of the education is focused not only on creating, like if you're an architect or if you're an agronomist, is not only focused on the object of creating, for example, beautiful architecture or about the object, but it's also focused about in the community. And I don't know if we can walk through your origins and when you started, how you, because you were born in New York to Puerto Rican and Dominican
No,
parents? No,
just Puerto
Cuban.
Rican.
Puerto Rican, just Puerto Rican. Sorry. I'm sorry. And then you went to Puerto Rico to
Right.
your university, your college. How
Mhm.
was that change of mentality, sort of
Yeah.
like come from the US to Puerto Rico, or like?
So I was thinking about that before when we had talked earlier. So when I went to school in the Bronx, and I'm from East Spanish Harlem in the Bronx,
Uh-huh.
the only kids in school were either Puerto Rican or Black. That was
Okay.
it. I think there was one guy, his name was Paul, but that was the whole experience, right? All through elementary school. And then when I went to high school and college in Puerto Rico, everybody was Puerto Rican, right? So I had no contact, no notion of what this thing was to study with people who weren't either Black or Puerto Rican. So then when I went to start my master's degree at LSU, it was kind of a shock, right? And again, I thought I spoke English, but when I got there, I didn't understand anything about what they were saying. And then the whole kind of, and going back to that Gabriel Garcia Marquez idea that we're people, but we're also part of the ecology from where we go, right? So from me, being brought up in the Bronx, I smell garbage and I feel like home, right? 'Cause that's what it was in the 70s up in the Bronx. When I smell sort of grass or seawater or something like that, it reminds me of Puerto Rico, right? So that's inside, right? That's part of my understanding of environment and ecology, right? So as landscape architects who are stewards of the environment, we carry this our own personal environment that's tied into the places we live and the culture and the experiences that are mixed up with that, because it's not only the environment, it's the personal relationships and all that sort of stuff.
True. No, and
So,
it's very interesting because, as you say, for example, in my experience as well, when I studied, we never studied something as a singular thing, but as a contextual thing. So, for example, as you say, for me, the mountains are very important. I miss them. But also always looking at the context, always looking at what's outside and how everything that we do is affected by other things. And I think that talks about also that those touching points between us that we have as community, we're community focused. But yeah. And then what is also something like, what are other influences apart from, your where you were born and your original landscape? But what would you say is something that you're inspired, or the values that made you now
yeah.
the professional you are?
I think so on and then going back to the idea of identity and Latino, Puerto Rican,
Yeah.
Caribbean, whatever that is. Um, I was, and again, being from the social economic background, when we were in the Bronx, we lived in the projects, and when we went to Puerto Rico, when I went to Puerto Rico, it's a small town in the Southwest with my grandparents, and they just had like a small, very small house, and they just had a little plot and some, my grandfather worked at the experiment station, and then he had chickens and pigs, and my grandmother grew like flowers and vegetables and stuff. So I think the biggest, and they grew up during the Depression, and they grew up poor and all this sort of stuff. But they going to the topic of resilience, they were unstoppable, right? My grandparents didn't finish the, first or second grade or something. So, but they could read very well and they could write very well. And they were aware of that sort of stuff, but they were incredibly hardworking and also very attuned to the earth, right? So my grandfather would only plant pigeon peas on the, en creciente or menguante and all that sort of stuff. And you had to cut the banana at a certain angle, leave it 3 days out so it could catch the dew on a high moon and all that sort of really sort of reading, being able to read the landscape, right? Traditionally, right? Because that comes from somewhere else. It does that he didn't know. I remember once I was taking an advanced physics class at the university, and we were studying the movement of the stars. So we had to track the stars. And then early one morning, I was with my grandfather, and I said, "Do you know what star that is?" And he started singing a song that he learned in school about the names of all the stars and where they're located in the sky. And I'm like,
Right.
man,
Right. And
I'm taking, yeah, I'm
that's
taking
so,
advanced physics and he can sing me a song about where the stars are.
yeah. Yeah, but and that is also like, you know, how the West or the global South and versus the global North, that a lot of our knowledge is
Ah,
ingrained in like the culture. So you have
yes,
songs, you have the like sort of
Yes,
trovadors, Colombia. You have all
I
of
figured you
these
were in your zone.
poems. We
I'm
have
gonna have to,
a
yeah.
person there.
Got
Hello.
excited about
Yeah, but that I was just saying that how in our culture we have this ingrained knowledge. We also have it in when there's medicine, you know, like the grandmothers would always say, "Oh, you want to cure something? I'll make you an aromatica," you know, like
yeah, yeah,
something
yeah,
that is
yeah,
an herb that will, and it actually that if you read now that is exists in the medication. So that
right, right,
understanding of the landscape in our cultures, it transcends, and
right,
it's still here, and it's I think we're losing it a little bit now.
yeah. We call it guarapo.
Guarapo. Ah, I thought guarapo was alcoholic, no?
No, no, no. It's,
No?
my grandma, whenever you were sick, she, "Ay, te voy a
Yeah.
hacer un guarapo
Guarapo.
de albahaca,"
Uh-huh,
or something
uh-huh.
like that.
Una aromática.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, that's so
Which is
nice.
kind of, I don't mean to interrupt, which is kind of interesting because we had a lecturer come to talk about the African slave trade in the Caribbean and the fact that a lot of the rituals that the slaves brought from, from Africa into the Caribbean islands, they couldn't be completely affected because they didn't know the plant material. So the union between the Africans and the indigenous populations, they worked together to translate plant material with ritual to
Wow.
create new rituals within the Caribbean islands, right? So
That's
that's why in Puerto Rico and I never knew the distinction until then. You have santero, but you also have curandera, right?
all
Santero
right.
is the one from African descent. The curandera is the one from indigenous descent. And
That
the
makes sense.
rituals look almost the same, but they come from two different kind of
Oh,
places.
wow. No, that's interesting. When I was living briefly in Richmond, Virginia. It was sort of I heard something like that. I was researching, I was working on this small garden, and I ran into this book that was talking about how the slaves, as you say, people who were enslaved that came
Mhm.
to the US, they couldn't find the plants, so they had to sort of re re-experience and experiment with each plant again to
Yes,
see
yeah.
what works, what didn't work, and they developed this book that is sort of like what served them for them at that time in that area of the country, which was the South, which was
Mhm.
heavily enslaved. But that's fascinating. Oh my God, no. And then after you left, then you did your master's degree, you came back to New York,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, I came back to
And
New York, and I like to tell my students that when I first got here, I sent out, and that was before email and everything. So I
right.
sent out 132 cover letters with resumes all over the place to see if I would get a job, right?
Yeah.
And I got 3 responses.
Responses, but offers?
One offer.
Oh my
So I mean,
God.
I think at least,
And at this time, you did them by email, right? Was
No, there
there?
was no
Yeah.
email. This is before email. This was a letter with an envelope
Oh my
and a post
God.
and a stamp, and you send them out.
I said
Um, by
that
word
was
by word processor. I typed it.
And at that time, like until then, who would you say is one of your favorite landscape architects? Like, or has it changed like from that time? Who did you admire? Who did you not
Yeah,
admire?
so that's an excellent question.
Yeah.
Because I never saw, at that time, I did not see landscape architecture as being something, this is gonna sound terrible, that I had to pay that much attention to, right? I
Okay.
was interested in landscape architecture because it was something I liked and I could make a living at it, right? Because that's the other thing about social economic, where you come from, right? From where I come from, you get a job, you work, you save up your money, and you kind of like move on. There wasn't that understanding or appreciation for a career, right? And that came later when I started taking an interest in design and stuff like that. And even now, I have a great admiration for a great many landscape architects,
Mm-hmm.
but I also kind of, there are enough people who are enamored with landscape architects that they can do their thing.
Mm-hmm.
I personally just kind of like that living experimental kind of people trying to figure things out, and you kind of like, you're trying to figure it out with them. So it's very low profile sort of kind of work.
That's so interesting. So yeah, I guess in a way, or would you say that when you started, the field was not as defined as it is now, in a way, and that's why
Um,
you're like leaning towards something that it was more experimental?
no, experimental. So I'll explain what I mean by experimental. So,
Okay.
so there's the kind of lived experience that goes on. So,
Mm.
so let me. So we had a studio this last semester in Puerto Rico. So they were doing, we did a design, and then some of the jurors said, that layout looks just like, that place looks just like New Jersey. You have a house, you have a lot. So what makes it Puerto Rican? Right? And which was a good question, right? So nobody knew. So we kept on, kept on, kept on. And finally, we sort of started talking about it. And what makes it Puerto Rican is that there are Puerto Ricans living there. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
That just that mere fact, the lived life of the people who are there is what makes the design and the landscape. It's not the definition of the forms, the shapes, and the patterns, right? Because once you make the form, the shape, and the pattern, it's solid. It's something. But people keep on living, people keep on changing, people keep on working. So that's what I mean by the experimentation, that
Listen.
that design is kind of like an ongoing living thing. And once you start putting names on it, it's frozen, which is fine. I mean, we have to have
Mhm,
standards, and we have to
mhm,
have,
mhm.
and that becomes part of the cultural legacy, the patrimonio,
Yeah, yeah. The
the thing
heritage.
that we carry forward, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think for me, in a way, or like it makes me think what you say, how landscape was something that you thought at the beginning was something that will make is like your craft and is something that will help you in life. For me, I unfortunately didn't didn't go. I if my story is that I would have loved to study landscape architecture since the beginning, but I
Hmm.
didn't know it existed. So
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
in Colombia and in a lot of Latin American countries, landscape architecture does not exist as a career, and it
Right.
is relegated to it's almost like, oh, gardening, or you know how in the past like engineers uh would talk bad about architects. It's like architects look bad or look down on the landscape architects, and it's very interesting how now, like being here in the US, I think it is very important, even this right now that we have this talk and we have the opportunity to talk to you and all of your experience to like bring the field into more importance, because it does matter, and people don't notice it, as you say, is part of our culture, is part of the that experiential thing, and yes, anyways, but and then after that, that you said that at some point that you were in Mexico City doing a studio
We
with
were in
some of
Mexico City.
the
It was an accreditation visit. It was something called
oh
ASLA visit, stuff like that. Yeah.
yeah, and then and you were and I guess I don't know if you I remember you had some story about, or no, was it Puerto Rico that you made this studio? And then I don't know if you can tell us about that
Yeah, so
studio.
we had last semester we ran 3 studios with the topic of resilience and plurality. So
Hmm.
that's the we talk about resilience in sort of objectified forms, build a wall, check the sea level, all that sort of structural stuff. But then there are parts and bits and pieces that we never kind of get to because they're hard to analyze. You can't really put them on a chart or anything like that, and that's what we were calling plurality. So in our particular case, we did a timeline of the history of Puerto Rico, right? So it was from the day before Christopher Columbus got there, October 1493, to the
Hmm.
present, right? So we did that timeline with all the historic things, and we did some speculations on what the maps would have looked like at the time and stuff. And part of the reviews during midterm, somebody said, but the history of Puerto Rico is terrible, right? If you look at that timeline, right? Not terrible, but in a sense, because it's a lot about imperialism, colonialism, exploitation, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And that was a theme that caught us through the entire, semester.
Huh.
And the question was, and then we actually got to go to Puerto Rico to see what was going on. And then when we came back, that's where we came up with this idea of history is written by the history people, the people who win, write the
Yeah.
history in their kind of version.
Hmm.
While they're writing this history, people are living their lives,
Right.
right? Undocumented history, right? So while you talk about the Americans invaded Puerto Rico in 1898, but people were just working. They may have seen in Guanica, they may have seen the soldiers coming down, but they were just minding their own business. What I find fascinating is when I talk to my grandmother and when I talk to my grandfather and all the older people in Puerto Rico when I was there, none of them really, World War II, hey, what? What? Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
that's when so and so went off. I remember when that, or depression, oh, we were always hungry. So depression was not. So all of these facts and all of these historic things wasn't really not part of the daily life of people. So that's why people can continue to live even though these things are going on. And that's real resiliency, right? That's where resiliency comes in.
Right.
They can adapt to everything. The history is, world's coming to an end. Yeah, I got to go to work. I got to take the kids to school. Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Right. Right. No, and this is fascinating because you as an academic and as a person who is like talking about these topics, I wonder what was the reaction, because I imagine when you do these studios and when you were leading these projects, what was the reaction, or what did you notice in between people? Because I'm sure you have a lot of students that are mostly very American or very Asian or very Indian. Like, what was the reaction like in this? Did you notice something?
Yeah. So,
Did
so
they?
So one of the things that we did in studio before we took the visit
Yeah.
was to do a deep dive about Puerto Rico from the perspective of music. So we went everything from early music, 1800s, La Danza, all the way to Bad Bunny and reggaeton. So
Wow.
every week we would listen and we would talk about the music, the instruments that were being played,
Right.
the songs and the context about what was being done. And we also did a run through foods, the types of foods and stuff like that. And during that time, there was a lot of conversation back and forth. It's like, oh, so we have that same sort of food in India. Oh, so that's what we eat, so and so. Oh, those sort of rhythm, that sounds a little bit like this. So they started making those connections. I mean, the
It's
only
beautiful.
big controversy was Bad Bunny, but
It's still a controversy. Some people love him, some people hate him.
That was the only
No.
thing, but they started making those connections beforehand, right?
Wow.
And once they got to the island, they kind of started seeing things with a different, they weren't
Medical.
surprised by a lot of things.
Right. And how do you explain to them or to anyone how does that relate to landscape architecture? How do you make that connection? Because yeah, we're talking about delicious topics, food and music and
Yes,
everything. It's like how
yes, 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 and that's the thing, and I think that that's you hit it on the
Yeah.
head, and I think that's the thing about when whenever we talk about Latino culture, Hispanic culture, whatever you want to call it, we always reduce it, or not we, but it's always reduced to, oh, it's a Latino neighborhood, so we have to use vibrant colors. You know, we have to do a mural, they have to have a mural, they have to have spaces wide open because that's
Yeah.
what they do, kind of a thing, which
Yeah.
is, I mean, I'm just being a little facetious about the whole thing. But
No.
the thing is, that information did not translate necessarily into form. It translated into an empathy and understanding that made them more aware as designers to understand context.
Got it. So it became
Right?
like a tool. Like it's just a tool to understand and
Correct. Correct.
design better. No, that is fascinating. And then I know apart from all of the work, amazing work you do and all the stuff you are on to, you all are also were also the president of the Urban Sketchers movement now because I thought it started in Colombia, honestly. I thought it started in Bogota because I remember following it on Instagram and I was like, and then you tell me that it's like this whole international thing and I'm like, what? I don't know if you can tell us more about it. How did it start? When did you came in and how, you know?
I just kind of stumbled upon it. I
Yeah.
saw a website for urban sketchers in Singapore, and they just had these beautiful sort of sketches, and I'm like, wow, that's kind of amazing. Um, and then they had a symposium in Santo Domingo in 2011. So I just signed up and I went, and I was fascinated. I mean, I never saw people draw that way with that kind of enthusiasm and fervor and dedication, right? So we would go out to lunch and they would have their sketchbooks and they're talking to you and they're sketching and they would not stop, you know. And for me, even that I like to sketch a bit, but you know, I do one drawing every 6 months and put the sketchbook away, right? Not,
Yeah.
but what I really found fascinating was that they could draw landscapes better than I could.
And
And
they
that
were
made
not
me,
trained landscape architects?
no,
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 nothing.
and that pissed me off. I'm like,
What?
no, I'm a landscape architect. I should be able to draw landscapes better than you.
Yeah.
This is
Oh,
kind
so
of childish, but whatever.
yeah, was it it's a multidisciplinary group of people, so it's not
Oh, yeah,
even
yeah, yeah, yeah.
architects, like it can be
No,
anyone.
no, no,
Oh,
no, no. There are
wow.
very few architects. There were mostly graphic designers, artists, formal artists.
I think,
There was a neurologist. And from that
wow.
point on, I just started getting very involved. We started a group in New York, Urban Sketchers New York. Then I became part of the board. Then I became vice president. Then I became president. Uh,
I think you shared with me some of one of these. Apologies for not sharing it
oh, yeah,
before,
yeah. So
but
when I started working here, when I was made the offer to teach, my chair, she's now the dean, Laura Lawson, asked me, so what do you plan on doing your research on? And I just had this long sort of rehearsed sort of statement about green infrastructure and resilience and sustainability and all the kind of good stuff that we kind of talk about. And she just looked at me and smiled and she said, come on, what do you really want to do? And
you're
I
like
told
draw.
her, yeah, I just wanna sit around, doodle and think. And she says, that's great. You're just gonna have to find a better way of saying that. So that's where all this sort of sketching came from, right? So
Okay.
to get tenure, when you work towards getting tenure, what I did was focus on sketching in place, sketch walks, and how do you document space and stuff like that. So when I would travel, I took very few pictures and just relied on sketchbooks to document my travel, to document space. So I would, I would come home with like, oh, so did you, how many, I didn't go there. I was busy. I saw a little thing over on the corner and I stayed drawing it for like 3 days because I found it was interesting. So that was
That's
kind of,
amazing.
yeah.
How fast can you sketch now?
So I don't spend more than 20 minutes on any sketch.
Okay.
Because I'm not, and that's the distinction that I make with the other urban sketchers is I'm not an artist. I'm not
Right.
interested in art in that form.
Mhm.
I'm interested in the documentation of what I see so I could use it later as a tool for design.
Right.
I understand.
And with your students, do you encourage like for them to use this medium or like a hybrid medium? Do you like what is your take on that?
Yeah, so it depends on the studio, but every studio students have to have a sketchbook. And it's
Right.
either, and just going back to your own sort of diagrams that you did to
Oh yeah.
here, which quite beautiful. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
those, right? So use that sort of way of thinking to sort of put down your thoughts, right?
Right.
And again, when we do sketch in studio, it's not about art. It's about design development, development of ideas, documentation. It's not the same because once you start talking about art, and everybody says, "Oh, I can't draw. I don't know."
It becomes untouchable and
Yes,
precious,
yes,
and
yes,
it's not a process for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
No, I think some, and I don't know, as I was saying that for me in a way, I think all of the you as a academic and as a great professional, you're already creating action, which is the action of teaching and research and all that, and that is commendable and that creates change because as we spoke before previously, I think also the change comes when you are in contact with a person, with the one-to-one person, and wonderful. I think it's wonderful what you're doing. I don't know. You had this all of these other. I think that this was talking about your landscapes,
Yeah, the
was
different
it?
landscapes that we kind of inherit. So on the left-hand side is Puerto Rico, that's a cane field, sugarcane field. In the middle are the projects, and on the other side, it's El Barrio, where sort of I grew up for years. Which is
Ah,
kind of funny because when I lived with my grandparents, their whole lives kind of revolved around these stories about sugarcane. Because most of the town was just, a few houses and sugar cane all around it. But when I lived there, there was no sugar cane. So they were always talking about sugar cane, but the sugar cane was not there anymore, right? Which I found kind of fascinating that this relationship to a cultivo, a
uh,
plant or
yeah,
a cultivar or a crop, right? This
yeah,
relationship
crop.
to a crop that no longer exists, but what exists are the stories that they tell about it and the relationship they had, right? Which is
Hmm.
again the relationship with landscape.
Hmm. In a way, would you say that New York has that sort of as a city has that sort of reading of the landscape because it's very like trying to think about what could be the parallel between cities, Latin American cities such as Puerto Rico that and Bogota, like there's a place called El Lago because there was a lake, now there's no lake. But
Right,
in I
right.
think one of the only cities that maybe I'm wrong, but here in New York, I think you still have those like remnants of ecological things that happen and now they don't exist. But I don't know. Would you?
Yeah. New
Yeah.
York is a kind of weird place because it's so constructed, right?
Mm,
It's so built up. It's so
yeah.
it's so hard, right? But it's incredible because in that harshness, you have all these different types of people living, right? So you have people who come from countries where it's tropical, you have people who come from countries that it snows all the time, and you have all these different landscapes that sort of huddle into these concrete brick and glass buildings, right? So I
Yeah.
find that kind of fascinating. So how does that negotiate, right? How
Right.
does that sort of
Right. I don't know. This was.
yeah, and that's this. So on the left-hand side are the typical homes of people that lived in the mountains in Puerto Rico. So when they came to New York, they started building their own versions of that, right?
Oh,
So
wow.
that's the casita, what's called the casita. So there are a bunch of these in all over Manhattan and the Bronx, but not so much
Oh,
anymore.
yeah.
So these are like social gathering places, right? And it's supposed to replicate that idea of La Casa en la Montaña,
La
the
casa.
house in the mountains.
Wow, that's so cool. And this
Oh,
is New
Jesus.
York.
That's New York, baby.
This
I
is
like to show this because that first photo is like kids playing in an open sewer next to a dead horse, right? So that's a playground. And I
yeah.
always relate that to kind of New York. New York, at least when I was growing up early on, New York was kind of rough, right? There was
Huh.
no, the playgrounds were like concrete culverts with pipes and asphalt and glass all over the place. So that's the kind of that's kind of playground. So I think it's kind of funny now that playgrounds are so kind of, you can't get hurt on.
Oh my God. And there's so many regulations
Yes.
and spacing and textures and all of this
Yeah,
fun
yeah, yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
Oh
yeah.
my God. No. And anyways, and this,
So one day when I went to LSU, when I was going to LSU, so the buses at LSU that take you from LSU to downtown, they came every half hour. But if
okay.
you walked, it would take you 20 minutes, right? So it was easier to walk than it was to take the bus. So one day I was walking and I saw these four houses and I was just like stunned. I was just kind of like, what is that? Reminds me of something,
La
right? So
casita.
yeah, and not only la casita, but also the way houses are arranged on sugarcane plantations. That's
Ah.
the way they're kind of arranged, one next to the other, workers kind of stuff. So that's what I did my thesis on when I was for my master's. It was the front yards of African American in an African American neighborhood, and I just documented what everybody had in their front yard. And
And
again, it was a beautiful story of resilience and creativity, how people put flowers out, how people made pots out of tires and Clorox and bleach bottles and all these and I collected the stories too. So there was an oral history behind the whole thing.
wow, that's
And it was deeply connected to again to Puerto Rico in a sense that these were poor people, right? These were
right.
poor working, and stuff. So, when like we talked before, there is that connection not only because of
Mm.
race or anything like that. There's also that social.
Yeah, that human connection. And when you did this project, how was that interaction? How was the because as you know, as landscape architects, we do a lot of these processes of community engagement and we design this. And I guess at that time, maybe those were not as designed as they are now. Like you were very like new to this, maybe. How was that process of engaging the community or
Yeah, it was super informal, right?
right,
So I
right.
would just walk through these neighborhoods and
Yeah.
people would just like look at me, but I walked like every day, right? So at a certain point they started getting used to me like walking around.
Yeah, yeah.
They're like, "Oh, so what are you looking at?" I'm like, "Oh, look at that. Well, what did you do there?" And they're like, "Oh, this is a pot that I guess somebody had thrown out this pot, so I took it home and then I put some dirt and then the lady, she gave me this little piece of a
That's
rose, so I put it in there and I watered it, and so that's
huh.
where that's sort of coming from. And then this plant, so what I found was that all the plants were almost like people, right? Every
Oh,
plant had a story. Oh, this one, that was Miss So-and-so. I remember it was raining that day and she didn't know what to do with it, so she gave it to me. So I brought it down again. That one I brought back from Jamaica. I hid it in my skirt, a little piece of paper.
right.
So plants were almost like people or pieces
Huh.
of parts of
Or
family. I found
yeah,
fascinating. Yeah.
like of the things of value,
Yes.
apparently, yeah. And then yeah, this will go back to the to that. But anyways, I think thank you for sharing with us all of your briefly all of your career and all of your knowledge. I'm sure there's a lot. Thank you so much for being here. I just as a as maybe as a closing or maybe as a call to action or something, what would you think first of all, would you what is a tip or what is a recommendation for future landscape architects um that you might think of sharing with us or anything?
I
Yeah.
don't, I know why don't you do that?
What I do
I think,
that?
let me just turn the tables now. So for you,
Okay.
how do you feel coming from Colombia and then from Colombia to RISD and then in New York? How do you feel? How are you
It's
navigating
it's been
that whole thing?
well, but coming back to the question of identity, that's something that I've never experienced in my life because as you know, back in well, Latin America is a very mixed place. So color-wise, we are all very mixed. My brother is darker skinned than me. I look like this, but we're all family. So
Mhm.
then that was the first time that coming to the US was a strange was a strange topic. And but that also made me more aware of my culture and more proud.
Mhm. Mhm.
So when I was back home, I would listen to all this like American music and like not like reggaeton or some stuff like that. And then when you're here, it's almost like you need a little bit of your culture. So it was something that I like gathered back. But it's quite weird. There was some experiences in 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 places where I've worked that also that notion of putting you in a little box that they cannot they cannot put you in a little box. So that was also something weird, but everything was good. And but honestly, I think that New York and Bogota, in New York is a very chaotic place. And it's very similar in a sense to Latin America. It's this mix of beautiful and chaotic and opportunities. Obviously, New York has a lot of more opportunities than Bogota. But yeah, no, I think also as a landscape architect, I think also bringing in all of this knowledge that I'm sure, like as I'm sure you are doing right now, is that knowledge of that I may not have all the knowledge, but maybe those little things of this plant grows like this, or um, you know how cows make paths in a lot. You know, like if you or I don't know if it was horses or donkeys that if you put you let the donkey down the hill and what's the path they're supposed to go through, that's
Mhm.
the easiest slope.
Yeah.
And you don't need an engineer for that. But you do need an engineer for that, which is
Yes,
good.
true,
But
true.
no, but not nothing like that. But I think also that other take, that other objective view, I think also as in all the profession as landscape architects, we're very concerned about climate change and about how we need to go back to nature. And I think us as Latin American landscape architects, we do have that already ingrained in our
Mm.
psyche, in our how we work. So I think we're great assets for today's world. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because in the end game is that we all have to acquire the kind of skills that we can be useful, right? So the same way our ancestors or our people knew about how to read the moon and how to read the land, we as current landscape architects need to know how to read the code, right? Read the,
Yes.
so it's a different thing, but we still have to have that sort of that level of ability and skill and craft to be able to take action, right? Because the action is not what I say, the action is what I do. Right?
Hmm.
That's the real kind of action.
Correct. Yeah. Sounds good. Okay. I think we're gonna break into questions.
I thought you,
So
I thought you were going to say we're going to break into dance.
break into dance because that's the stereotype, of course. Yes, that's what we're gonna do. Now we're gonna do a choreography. And no, we're gonna do some questions, answer some questions. If we still have people over here, we're gonna open I think now everybody's gonna show up. I think. I don't know if Diane,
Holy
if you're
cow,
over
who are
there.
all these people? Look at that.
I don't see anyone. Oh.
People don't have their cameras on, but they can please put them on
Okay.
if you would like to. I don't have mine on. I should put it on. And you can, I guess, raise your hand or put a
Write it
little
in the chat
emoji
if you'd like
and
to.
yeah, or you can write it in the chat, whatever you prefer. But please feel free to ask Richard and Lucila some questions.
Yeah.
Hey, Dean. Hey, Fernando.
¿Qué tal?
Hello.
Hi, Richard.
Hey.
Well, I don't mind going first. I want to ask a question. It's good to see everybody. Buenas tardes a todos.
Buenas
Um,
tardes.
I'm very interested that there's a generational difference here between Richard and our host, Lucila. And I want to hear Richard's vision of the future of where he thinks Latinos could be and how it could be working in academics, since that's your specialty, or in practice. And the same with you, Lucila, because my readings have been saying that by the time we get to the third generation of Latinos in the United States, we will have forgotten everything. Those guys are not going to be Latinos anymore. And I'm thinking, well, it could be, maybe it couldn't be, but I want to hear what your vision is for, let's say, 3 generations out. What's going to look like, Richard?
It's going to look very different. But that's a very interesting point because it does get lost after a while, right? So my nieces and nephews are not at all like what we were because they're another generation displaced. But what I think is kind of interesting is that thing that we have as Latinos, that connection to land and things, it may be lost in that third generation, but there's another generation somewhere back there that's just living it, and they're the ones who are gonna come forward again with it. It's almost like a cycle, right? It's like we turn into more anglicized or whatever it is, but then there's still people coming in, right? Keeping it sort of alive. I was kind of stunned. I was watching something, I forget where it was. In the Amazons. Little kids going to school in the jungle, right? In these shacks. They were just like little shacks and they were like writing on chalkboard, and all that sort of stuff. And that reminds me of the stories of people in Puerto Rico when the Americans came. So that stuff continues. That thing continues, right? So it may not be carried forward by us or our children, but it will be carried forward by the new people, the new wave that kind of comes in, I think.
True. No, I think Richard, yeah, you have a point. Like there's always going to be new people coming in, which is because we live in the reality is that we live in a globalized world and it's always changing. But I think we as an identity, we have this like we have the values of family, of community, and I think that will keep going even if we start losing our accents and stop dancing salsa. But I think those values are ingrained in a way, and as we inherit sicknesses, I think they will also come back with us. But yeah, for landscape architects, I think we definitely need more Latin heritage landscape architects to come into to here to New York or to be raised in here. But it is gonna be different. But I think some things will never change.
But
Well,
then,
I'm glad to hear that both of you are very optimistic. I'm not so optimistic right now
but
because I think we don't have a scholarly base, an academic base yet that's producing literature. I've been reading Edward Casey, and he's just writing constantly about the Western history in the United States, and how it's developed. And so this guy is proliferating the same ideas, but then the next generation gets that information, and then the next generation gets that. And there's another scholar that follows along. And we're not doing that yet with landscape architecture, if that's really where we want to be. I'm not even talking about just landscape architecture, urban environments, urbanism, urban design. And there's some Latinos that are writing about that, but they stay within the political or economic scene and
Right.
not really taking it into creating environments. So
Well, I think in maybe here in the US, this is not very common, but in South America and in Colombia, there's a lot of people who are academics and yeah, so definitely there needs to be more connection between the Spanish or the Hispanic areas to here so that we can hear, like Jaime Lerner, Curitiba, like all of these like
Mm.
old
right.
old theory people. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, I've had to go to Mexican history, Mexican philosophy. Who knew it? There's Mexican philosophers, but are we
Yeah.
ever taught that in the university? No. So, I
No,
mean, there hasn't been this
true.
integration yet because we
Mm.
think of Mexico and Latin America as a global South. So there's this line, it's real, and it divides us.
True, true, true.
But thank you guys. This has been great. This is what we need, a forum like this. So
Yes.
Thanks, Fernando.
We
Yeah.
should keep doing it. Yeah. Any more questions, comments? No. Great. Okay.
I actually have one question to Richard. So Richard, I found it interesting in the beginning you talked about like we label all these heritages or Latinos or Asians, etc. But at the end of the day, they're all humans and maybe it's not as important. But throughout the whole dialogue, I saw like both you and Lucila keep coming back to your root, your Puerto Rican upbringing, ideas. So is it still important that we think about our heritages, or is it more important that we overcome that heritage? What do you think?
That's a
Too deep? Too deep?
that was rough. That's a rough question. So the first, I mean, and Lucila, feel free to sort of jump in. So
Because I was the opposite. Like when I was younger, I thought it's important to overcome that heritage and
yeah.
beyond that. But now I'm actually finding myself going back to that because
Right.
I feel it's actually an important thing.
Right. Because I agree. When I was young, I had no interest in, and eventually, that's who I'll speak for myself. That's who I am, and I can't hide it. So it's going to come out somewhere, right?
Mhm.
And the less I fight it, the easier it is for me to sort of live with it, right? Because and I'll be sort of totally blunt as a Puerto Rican guy who grew up in the projects. I've got an attitude, right? I've got something that just sort of can easily, I can go off that. I don't do it anymore, but I'm prone to sort of like, what? The whole hand and the whole sort of like, stuff. And that's just natural. At least for me, it was just a natural impulse. And it comes from the environment in which I was brought up, right?
Right.
And that needed to be sort of tampered down so I could go ahead. But then after that, I found the beauty of the people who came before me, right? Grandparents who worked like crazy, an uncle who, became a teacher after so many years, an aunt that had like 12 kids, another great uncle that took a boat to the Dominican Republic to cut sugar cane and then came back. All of those stories of strength and resilience and adaptation. And I'm like, I'm going to keep going no matter what. All mixed in with wonderful food and wonderful music and wonderful poetry and wonderful literature.
Yeah.
That's an incredible kind of celebration, right?
Yeah. True. I think in my case, or I definitely grew up with a lot of family history of heritage of like this is what your great 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 grandmother used to do, or like this is the like my dad always talks about how my grandmother used to go to this like boarding school to the capital. So they had to do this like horseback, train, boat to get her to school. Like, and it's all this whole story. So like I grew up with these histories, these things, and I would never want to disassociate from my culture or from my family. And maybe, you know, sometimes it's problematic if you talk about religion and stuff like that, but it is part of us. And as Richard's saying, it is easier if you just accept it and you're just like, it's just a little part of you, and then you just add on to the other stuff that comes in. But I think it makes a difference because for me, it grounds me a lot and it makes me feel safe to go back to this safe space that is food, that is my food, my music, my family, my language. And and it's amazing to also to share it with everyone. And I would love for everyone to love everything of my culture. Sometimes they cannot dance, but it's okay. Oh my God.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Richard and Lucila. We are 1 minute
you.
over our 1 hour time. It was such a fascinating dialogue, such a warm-hearted conversation. I was smiling the whole time.
Oh,
Although at times you were talking about like poverty or project or difficulties, but I think the whole discussion was really like giving us a lot of hope for our roots and heritages. And Fernando like rightfully pointed out, like we should continue this forum and discussion. So that wraps up tonight's dialogue. Our next quarterly BIPOC dialogue will be in September. I hope to see you back all in September.
Right.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you.